Greetings ladies and gentlemen, time for another review. Today we'll be looking at the Tin HiFi T3. It comes in a sort of fake leather booklet, or bookcase almost, with a bunch of different tips, some in foam and some in various types of silicone, and a manual at the bottom. This also had an insert where the IEMs were sitting in, but all sort of nice presentation and done in an affordable way. It's made out of cardboard, so but nice nonetheless. The IEM is where it really gets interesting. As you can see, it has a braided cable, a silver-plated copper cable with some sort of silicone insulation, so it's not quite as nice as the more expensive cables that use Teflon insulation. But on the other hand, this means it is, as you can see, it's very, very soft and pliable. So it's sort of it's very light and contorts to the shapes you might want very easily. But the downside is that it has a bit more sort of a bit less shape memory, should we say? But in an unfortunate way, it does. It becomes a bit janky, as you can see. It doesn't quite hang straight when I pull it. But that aside, it's a very, very nice cable, especially considering the price. It has a aluminium splitter with a logo on and an acrylic bead there to pull the split up if you want to put it around your back, and a standard 3.5mm jack in chrome plating and carbon fibre in the middle. Generally, overall, an extremely nice cable, honestly. The IEMs themselves have MMCX connectors, and they are made entirely out of metal. Seems like one machined bit of aluminium. Quite heavy type of aluminium, I might say, though. With a small port on the back here, but very, very tiny, and otherwise just one solid piece. The small step down you see along here can become a bit sort of, these small sort of edges all over, they can become a bit of a problem if you do something like laying down on your side with them in your ears, but you can do it because they're actually impressively comfortable considering what they look like. Because as you can see from the side, it's a perfect cylinder and extends out a fair bit from the actual connector. So long as your ears aren't significantly smaller than the tip size you're using, and that the tip size that matches the diameter of the actual housing itself, they're actually very, very comfortable, all things considered. A bit heavy though. So I'd say the only thing about the build that I think looks a bit cheap is the plastic that they've used to indicate left and right, red on one and blue on the other, around the MMCX connector. That sort of has a faded look to it, which looks not that great. But honestly, it's a piece of plastic indicating left and right side. It's not really that important, when the rest of it is honestly, well, about as perfect as you can get for a quality on an IEM, I'd say, regardless of price. So the comfort's pretty good, build quality is nigh on perfect. Then we get to the sound. The sound is where things get really interesting. Now these, as opposed to the previous model, the T2, use a Knowles balanced armature for the top frequencies, and then their own dynamic driver for the low frequencies. And you can tell that they want to show off that Knowles driver, which they do, but at a certain price. Like I said, the Knowles driver is for the high frequencies, and what they've done is essentially they've turned up the high frequencies to, well, I'd say 11. It's not as bad as some others, but I think I might have the explanation why. If you look at these, are a testament to an example of an IEM that is done, or rather a driver that has been used correctly, in that it actually sounds like its frequency response would suggest, which means that the crossover design has been done very well, in that it's not trying to force the drivers to do something they aren't actually capable of, which means they actually provide this response that they are doing cleanly. They're not distorting at any part of the frequency band due to having been forced into fitting together. They're actually drivers that are matched properly. but it essentially has a flat low end that sort of rolls off a tiny bit, but generally speaking a pretty flat low end that goes up to the mid-range, and then around sort of, I believe it's around like 2 or 3k, it spikes up quite a lot and then goes on like that on a quite high level for quite a while, up until about, I think it's around 10 11k, it sort of goes down again. And whilst that is somewhat reminiscent of the Harman target response, I think that area might be a bit too elevated for my tastes. But what I am happy about is that they stopped it at 10 or 11k, because when you start having elevated frequencies above that area, or in that area I should say, and further on, that's when it starts to get really fatiguing, at least for me anyway. That's what happens with the Fostex TH900 and what happened with the Odyssey LCD4, and to some extent my IE800 even does this, where it has energy up there which gives it quote unquote air and sparkle, but it tends to, when you are working with overly processed music, like a lot of metal is, for example, especially when you get into the more extreme kinds of it, in the death and black metal genres, that area, the high frequency noise in produced music can really become an issue. It still is with these, and due to the fact that section has been elevated as much as it has, you borderline can't listen to those genres, like the very extremely processed, heavily processed genres of noise in the upper frequencies. They just become way too bright for that, unless you listen at very low volumes anyway. Which is a shame, but at least it's in a frequency band where it's obvious. You know it's happening. It's not like the LCD4 where it sneaks up on you and you're suddenly really tired, or your ears are. Honestly, you're listening to for a while and you keep turning it off, and at some point your ears start bleeding. These, you know it's happening. These honestly, when I heard a snare drum, and this the first time when I had it turned up, it literally sounded like I had my head inside the snare drum. Like, bass can hit, but in these, the treble hits. Like I could actually almost feel the hit of the snare drum, which is a cool effect, but it will probably make your ears bleed if you keep doing that for too long. Now, that being said, that might sound like a massive flaw. I honestly don't think it is, because if you listen at a more sort of less extreme volume, or if you just don't listen to overly processed music, that brightness turns into something else, which is air, but air and detail and space. If you listen to genres like jazz with, for example, the kinds like Paulo Fresu and I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head, but the more sort of slightly darker jazz music especially, but generally just instrumental music that hasn't been heavily processed, that doesn't have, because those instruments just don't naturally have information in that high frequency area to such an extent. That means that this just highlights the details to an extreme degree, where you can just hear all the textures and all the tiny fine details like you wouldn't believe, and you get a nice sense of space and air around you. The soundstage for an IEM is actually quite impressive. It goes like a bit like this much outside your actual ear, and with I was listening to some sort of chill lounge jazz music, electronic, bordering on hip hop genre wise, where I could actually tell there was a trumpet that was sort of in front of me, slightly up to the right, and there was a standing bass that was to the back, right in my left ear, and then there's a piano that was behind me, slightly on level with me, maybe a tiny bit below me, but basically at the same level height as I was. So you get like all dimensions in terms of directionality with the soundstage, or the imaging rather, which is extremely impressive, honestly, especially at this price point. And couple that with the incredible amount of detail, and I really have to respect what they've done with it, in spite of the fact that I personally don't particularly like bright sound signatures. These just use it in a way that is actually impressive. The mid-range doesn't really draw attention to itself. It's completely perfectly integrated into the transition of the sound, and I believe perfectly detailed just as the rest of it, but due to the brightness it doesn't really draw that much attention to itself. But it's not recessed either. It is, like I said, it's elevated highs and then flat, neutral down to the bass area. Speaking of the bass, where the dynamic driver takes over, that dynamic driver is actually doing a really good job of it. It's not as snappy and crisp, if you will, as a balanced armature bass driver, or as a smaller or more expensive dynamic driver like the one in my IE800 might be. But it's fairly close, and it's not distorting or muffling either. It is clean. It's very clean and smooth, and it has the sort of springiness to it that a dynamic driver can have when it's done right, where bass notes sort of they bounce, so to speak. They're not a hard hit full stop like an armature does, but they are not muffling either. They're not rounded off or softened. They just sort of have a spring in their step, so to speak. So if you listen to EDM and that sort of music, electronic music that has a hard-hitting low end, there's enough of the bass. I'd love to have more of it relative to the treble, but there's enough of it that it still remains neutral. It doesn't sound like the bass is actually recessed as such. So there's enough of it that it's good, and the quality of it's really nice. It actually grooves along, so to speak, really well. So it actually works well if you find electronic music that doesn't have that high frequency noise, which can become irritating when they, especially if you take something like drum and bass, they might use samples of a drum kit, which would often be very bright in its actual tonality due to the way they've used it or mixed it, and then it becomes just so it can become quite you flinch, let's put it that way. But when you find something that doesn't have that over processed sound, it will work well. The bass quality is really good. So at the end of the day, I'd say this is an IEM that, in terms of raw performance, disregarding the sound signature, in terms of raw performance, this one is honestly, if I didn't know the price, which is $70, I'd say this costs several $100s. Like, I'd perfectly be able to accept someone telling me that these were a competitor in price-wise to the Sennheiser IE800, or like the I say probably even in the like the Shure 846, or that sort of not quite the Noble Katana level of price range. Obviously the Noble Katana is still way ahead of this, but this is in the getting into the serious part of the IEM game, honestly, for a price that you might think this was just throwaway garbage, to be honest. But both build quality and precision wise, this is like getting into the high end. The sound signature, however, does limit it genre-wise, which is why I'll heartily recommend this. But with the note that if you listen to more extreme processed genres, like a lot of metal, like some electronic music, that sort of thing, these might work for you if you don't listen at very loud volumes, but I'd suggest you try them before you buy them. However, if you listen primarily to non-processed music that uses real instruments, such as jazz, or folk music, or anything that has just an instrument in a room recorded, that sort of thing, then I'd say buy these in a heartbeat. Honestly, you'll have to go into the $1,000 area before you start getting something that is like clearly better. Like, even in that area, I'd honestly say for some genres of music, this is more of a side grade than an upgrade if you buy something that expensive. So yes, without hyping them too much, I'd say these are very, very impressive, but the sound signature is a killer. You might be able to EQ it. I haven't quite experimented with that as much as I'd like to. I'll do that in the future. So if you ask, I might be able to tell you whether or not it's worked. But otherwise, as is, heavily recommended. 10 out of 10, honestly, in terms of the execution, considering the price. The build quality is, regardless of price, almost as well done as you can. Yeah, that's my thoughts on the TIN T3. Quite curious about the P1, if I can get my hands on it at some point. And a lot of other Chinese headphones. But for now, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about these or anything else in terms of... I should mention most of my listening on this was done with the AudioQuest Dragonfly Carbon, oh not Carbon, what's it called, Cobalt, and the Aslan Kern AK240. If you have any questions regarding anything else HiFi related, feel free to ask me in the comment section. I'll get to it when I can. Otherwise, see you next time, and goodbye.